In this video, we'll be taking a look at the challenges and responses in post-colonial Pakistan. This will be our last video on Pakistan as we start to move forward into India and its rise of democracy. And so this will be the last bit of Pakistan as far as our independence unit. So the question being, what challenges did independent Pakistan face and how did it respond? The legacies of partition. So let's start with economic and social challenges. At partition, the split 90% of all the industries in this region here in the map, were in India proper, as well as most of the railways and hydroelectric plants. So most of the stuff that's going to help your economy is in India. Most of the major cities, Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, they're in India too. And so Pakistan's at a clear disadvantage when it just comes to industry. Their only major city that they have to help out is Lahore, and it's the only city of economic and cultural significance in Pakistan. Their economy was mainly agriculture with very few exports, and a large part of their population were poor farmers, so they're starting out in a pretty weak position when it comes to their economy. And so this is a little map showing the split. And we have the boundary of the empire, where it was in 1939, India, and then Pakistan is split in half, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, which is going to cause a whole lot of problems down the line, and eventual independence of East Pakistan. We also see little arrows when it comes to the movements of refugees, Muslim or Hindu, in or out of Pakistan and India. Speaking of refugees, and so refugees coming to Pakistan formed a larger part of the population than in India. So more people were going into Pakistan than were going into India. And those coming were largely unskilled rural workers, kind of these lower class farmers. And a lot of their best people were fleeing from Pakistan. They had a bit of a brain drain because their best professionals, their skilled workers, and their traders, their top people were all going to India and getting out of Pakistan. And so they left a company of an economy of largely unskilled workers, and it's going to really hurt their economy in the long run. The majority of Pakistan, they shared a common religion, but that's about it. They didn't have a common language or culture, and there are vast differences between East Pakistan, Bengal, versus West Pakistan. But even within West Pakistan, the people on the northern frontier areas near Afghanistan, they're more used to autonomy. They're more used to kind of doing things their own way. And so religion is the only thing that's tying them together, and that just may not be enough for them to be strong. And so here's some depressing pictures of the refugees along the way. Disputes over assets as far as when they have their split, who gets the money. India, well, they get the most. They inherit most of the administrative structures from British India, as in their courts, their government buildings. A lot of the buildings for government are already there. Whereas Pakistan, they have to build an entirely new government system, new courts, new buildings. And so it's going to be a lot more work to build up that infrastructure for a new government. Currently, the Parliament of India, they're using the same parliament that was set up in 1927 by the British, whereas Pakistan, they have to set up something completely new. Pakistan covered 23% of the land mass of British India, but they only got a smaller chunk of the financial assets. They get 17.5% of the money. And India wasn't too happy to give them even that, but Gandhi fasted in favor of Pakistan to make sure they got at least some money. And Pakistan realized that's the best deal they're going to get, especially with Gandhi on their side. And so they kind of took this unfair deal. And you can see from this chart that their economy doesn't get much better. They're still going to be kind of below India almost perpetually unless there's some major change. And we're just looking at GDP growth, 6.4% growth from Pakistan versus 9.2% in India. How much they're producing in billions. India, 1,098 versus Pakistan, 143. They're just not doing as well. Per capita GDP, as far as if you divide that amongst the entire population, pretty close, but India has a much larger population. So in the end, Pakistan's economy is still pretty weak as a result of this brain drain and not getting the best resources at the end of the partition. As far as the military, it's also uneven, but Pakistan's catching up. Uh, Pakistan got 1/3 of the military and equipment, but most of the supplies were in the Indian territory, and India was very slow to kind of give up that equipment, and there was some bias, most definitely, in giving up that equipment. And then they started to have fights very early on the split, and India decided to keep some of that equipment. And so conflicts with India over the Kashmir territory, which continue to this day, they really showed that Pakistan had a very weak position, that India could do what they wanted. Pakistan used whatever resources they had, which were incredibly scarce, to build up their military at the cost of really depending on foreign aid, mostly in the Americans. But this also slowed their economic and social development where they could have been. Instead, they really built up their military to try to stand up against the Indians. As far as land, a lot of the top areas of strategic importance, with Muslim majorities, they were still given to India. And so this pushed Pakistan to fight over at least Kashmir, which was right on their border with the Muslim majorities. They figured they should at least have that. And so here's a nasty little cartoon showing just this buildup of military on both sides. India can afford it mostly, whereas Pakistan, they can't, and it's at the cost of their own people and dependence on government like us. Pakistan was split into East and West Pakistan. So this is one country split by 930 miles, and that's across Indian territory, which kind of becomes an enemy. And so it's really not going to work out. Over half the Pakistanis, they lived in East Pakistan. And the eastern half is economically undeveloped. They're not where they should be. And they're subject to a lot of environmental factors and constant flooding. And so they're just not where they could be. The only really uniting factor is religion. Ethnically, they are vastly different. Languages are vastly different. East Pakistan is under the Bengali language and culture. And so they are very much united. And they're not a fan of West Pakistan. They resent the political and economic dominance of the Urdu-speaking peoples of the West, including in Pakistan. And the Bengalis were then underrepresented in the new Pakistani military, as well as the new government. And so they started to feel exploited by West Pakistan. They started to feel like they were a colony and not much was getting really better. So here's a breakdown as far as the religions in these areas. So we still have a sizable Muslim minority in India, smaller minorities in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and that's really it's really only the thing that's uniting them. So what happens in Bangladesh? Well, they split. The Awami League is a Bengali party that demanded greater autonomy. They wanted more rights over their own land. West Pakistan decided, no, that's not okay. And so they arrest the main leaders of the Awami Party, or the Awami League, and they crushed all protests. 1971, the West Pakistani troops crushed an uprising calling for the secession. They want to secede of East Pakistan, causing 10 million refugees to flee into India. India's not happy about this, so they decide to intervene. They don't want to deal with 10 million refugees. So Indian troops enter East Pakistan, causing the remaining 93,000 Pakistani troops to surrender quite easily with not much of a fight. East Pakistan declares independence and they become Bangladesh. As far as challenges within Pakistan, Pakistan didn't have the same continuity of leadership that India had. Jinnah dies of tuberculosis 1 year after becoming their first leader. His successor, Liaquat Ali Khan, was assassinated in 1951 because his policies were largely secular, like Jinnah. And so we had some religious extremists take him out, and he was seen as weak during negotiations with Nehru over Kashmir. And he just wasn't seen as being strong enough. And so they go through this series of leaders, as opposed to India, where they're pretty much going to have the same leaders and Nehru for quite a bit, all the way up until his death in 1964, whereas Pakistan's going to go through a series of weak leaders. Congress, they had time to build up their leaders through the independence movement, and that's how they run their government. It was those leaders. The Muslim League, their support was largely based in the Uttar Pradesh province, which was in India. And so any Muslims in that province were either going to stay in India, or if they did decide to move to Pakistan, they would move as refugees, and they had to compete for land and jobs with the other millions of refugees, and so they didn't really rise to the top. The first drafts of the Pakistani constitution were rejected. The Bengalis weren't happy because it gave too much power to the central government. They wanted more autonomy. And a lot of Muslim scholars saw it as too secular, as not following Islamic rulers. And so the constitution was finally adopted in 1956 after many, many fights. And so Jinnah's dream is not going too well, so Jinnah dies early, and here's his tomb. Political challenges. 1958, General Ayub Khan suspends the constitution after only 2 years, and this starts a nasty pattern of military takeovers followed by weak civilian rulers. The military had to be strong because of their weak economy, disputes over Kashmir, and a fear of weak borders against the Indian army. So they kept building up that military just in case, for Kashmir, for India. And then the Cold War comes along, and we kind of make it worse. The U.S. forms an alliance with Pakistan because of its strategic position right next to Russia and China. And so we decided to pump in military supplies and financial aid into Pakistan. And as we started to really build up that military, this led to a weaker democracy because the military kept taking over anytime their government was seen as weak. And so they just continue this pattern of military takeovers that continues to this day. As far as the war on terror, the U.S. led an invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 after the attacks of 9/11. And this led to a destabilizing of Pakistani's military, their economy, and their government, as they had to deal with refugee crises, in addition to a lot of these terrorists, including the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, crossing the border into Pakistan. And so their military has kind of overtaken them. So here's an example of the Indian military versus the Pakistani military. Whereas the Indian military, they can afford it. Pakistan, largely they're depending on us to build up their military. As far as Kashmir, the UN intervened, as the UN's formed right after World War II as a peacekeeping organization. The UN divides Kashmir in 1949, and they keep the UN there as a peacekeeping process to make sure that it doesn't lead to a fight. And so they're just on the border waiting just in case. The Pakistanis believe that all of Kashmir should be theirs, as the population in the area is majority Muslim. But they just didn't have the military. That's another reason why they kept building up their military. And so this led to more and more wars over this little chunk of land. Wars in 1965, wars in 1999 over this chunk of land. Starting in the 80s, 1987, we started to see Muslim separatists in Kashmir, supported by Pakistan, starting to fight the Indian government for their own independence to become part of Pakistan. And this becomes much more complicated when nuclear weapons get involved. India gains nuclear weapons in 1974, Pakistan in 1990, and it gets quite scary in 1998 when both sides start to test nuclear weapons as kind of a I test one, you test one, back and forth. And so it gets pretty scary as we almost hit World War III, fighting over this little land called Kashmir. So this should help to answer the question, what some of the challenges did independent Pakistan face and how did they respond? So it's not going well, but we'll take a look at India on the Indian side of things in the next few videos.